Grief is real, big, better shared. The podcast everyone needs to hear, but nobody wants to hear.
I'm Kevin Lee, President and CEO of Mid-America Transplant, and we are honored to sponsor this episode of Grief is Real, Big, Better Shared. At Mid-America Transplant, we have the privilege of working with families across southern Missouri and northeast Arkansas who make the heroic decision to donate their loved ones' organs or tissues. While donation often brings families comfort, they are still heartbroken by their loss. We are driven by compassion for these families and continue to walk with them through their grief journey. Mid-America Transplant provides several programs to help families memorialize their loved one, but we believe that some of the best support can be provided by a grief center. We are proud to work with the Center for Good Grief and appreciate everything they are doing in the region to bring healing to people who are coping with loss. Mid-America Transplant is inspired by life and by the donor families who give transplant patients a second chance at life. For more information about being a donor, visit sayyesgivelife.org.
Hello, welcome to Grief is Real, Big, Better Shared, the podcast everyone needs to hear, but nobody wants to hear. I'm Angela Hamblin-Kelly, the administrator of the Baptist Centers for Good Grief, and I'm joined here today with one of my incredible colleagues to talk about grief and memorialization. Before we jump in, let's talk about grief for just a minute. What is grief? We say that grief is all the thoughts and feelings that run around inside our heads, hearts, and bodies. We know that we grieve in 5 ways. We grieve physically, cognitively, emotionally, spiritually, and behaviorally. We know that it is possible to cope with grief, but that it takes active attention, time, and support. That's why we have this podcast. Mainly because grief is the most universal experience there is. Again, this is the podcast everyone needs to hear because grief involves pain and vulnerability, which is also why this is the podcast nobody wants to hear. So today, we're going to talk about the importance of memorialization with one of our grief counselors, Maria. Hello, Maria.
Hi, Angela.
I'm so appreciate you being here today. Let's just jump in. Let's get started. What even is memorialization?
Yeah, so memorialization is any way that we honor or celebrate the life of our loved one who has passed away. And we know that it can help with the grieving process.
Yes, I think most people think it's the funeral or memorial service only, period, the end.
Yes, I hear that so often when I talk about this with my clients. And it can be any time, whether it's at the beginning of our grieving process or any time throughout. It's so much more than just the funeral or that memorial afterwards. It is an ongoing need that we see that we have as grievers.
So that's a good point, because once people realize, oh, it's not just the funeral, it's not just the memorial service, it's ongoing, then they sometimes struggle with, well, is it like, do we have to have another funeral? Like, people think it always has to be as big. Memorialization has to be as big as an event or a funeral or something like that.
Yeah, definitely. And I think when we hear this word memorialization and we hear memorial even in the title, we think it needs to be something as big as those initial events. But it can be something small and intimate. It can also still be those larger ideas as well that we do. But it's just all about how do we stay connected? How do we do this individually? And also, how can we do this as a family or as a group of grievers as well? So it doesn't have to be something as big as that funeral or that memorial to be meaningful and connecting.
So connection, you said connection. Memorialization is a key piece of that connection. And we know that we have certain needs when we're mourning. It's not a checklist. It's not a recipe for grief, but we as grievers do have needs, mourning needs. Alan Wolfelt has taught us about those over the years, as well as William Worden. And so our needs of mourning really, when I think about them, come back to this act of memorialization, because our needs are about expression and support, a new identity, feeling the pain. And oftentimes it is through some type of act of memorialization that really allows us to find our way into our mourning and to work on those needs of mourning. So you said memorialization is a healthy expression of grief. It can be a ritual of remembrance that you do alone or with other people. Let's talk about some actual examples, especially like you and I both work with grieving people of all ages. And so we can talk about that too, the difference in ages, but also different ways that we've seen people memorialize their loved ones that have helped them. I mean, this is all coming back to helping people find healthy ways of grieving. This is not to delay grief or relive the funeral forever. This is actually a healthy act. So let's talk about some of the ways of memorialization that we've seen.
Sure. Yeah. So what I have seen, there are so many different things that can be meaningful to someone. And just like we already said, it doesn't need to be something big. It can be something as small as keeping a journal where you write to your loved one. I have seen that be something that is so helpful. And that's not even an event that we're planning. That is something that we can do spontaneously to remember and to remain close. And it just takes a paper and a pen. So even something just like that, I've seen be so helpful to some of our clients.
I have several clients who have done that and kept those journals and how helpful that's been. So, yeah. And also, we'll talk too through here. Sometimes memorialization, people think, oh, it's the holidays. Mm-hmm. And that sometimes people will maybe lean into this act a little bit more because it's the holidays and it feels just naturally like this is something we should do. But this isn't just a holiday event either. Like you said, this is something we can do all the time. But one thing that strikes my mind that people do a lot on holidays, special days, it could be birthdays, anniversaries, but lighting a candle.
Yes.
Being very intentional about lighting a candle and either saying to yourself or when you're gathered with people, today we light this candle in memory of. I may have shared this before on the podcast, but when my father died, being the good grief counselor that I am, I was like, we were going to light a candle on our first holiday without him. And I don't know, my mom had gone through this phase where she had floating candles. I think it was a thing like in the 90s. And my dad thought they were really stupid. Why would you have this bowl of water and put a candle in it and decorate it? And but there's water everywhere at some point. So he really did not hold back. He thought it was really stupid. So the first holiday we were doing this, I was like, we're going to light floating candles. And that's what we did. And we did that for a number of years because it kind of made us chuckle. It made us remember his unique personality. But it was also that act of memorialization. And we would keep it lit all day during that special day. And so people will do that sometimes with birthdays. So again, it's an act of celebration, an act of love, an act of remembrance.
Yes, definitely. And I feel like on special days, we like to have those more concrete things we can do, whether it's lighting a candle to represent, or I've had clients who will have a special place at the table where there's maybe at the chair where their loved one once sat. And maybe whether you have a picture there or you don't have a picture there, something small but meaningful on the day itself to recognize they were here, they're still here in our hearts. How can we stay connected? How can we remember?
That chair, that's a great thing, too. I was thinking about a family. So, again, if you have a family and you're working on how do we do an act of memorialization together, because sometimes when it gets beyond us as the individual, we start panicking like, well, what if I upset my family? What if they're having a good day? But it's so important for families to do these types of things together. And one idea when you said the chair at the table, I had a family who they just had paper and markers and a stapler, and they made like a linking chain. So they cut, the strips of paper. They wrote memories and things about that person, and then they linked them together, stapled them, and they hung them over the chair on that Thanksgiving. And so that's another idea if you've got children or just as your family. I think they actually had the strips of paper at the front door, so when people came in, they really encouraged everybody to partake in that.
I love that. And what a simple way, but still such a personal way and almost a private way because, you've got just what was between you and your loved one, or even if it's something you also want to share, it can be whatever you need it to be on that link, on that chain.
Yeah. And it really helps, I think, address the elephant in the room, for lack of a better way of saying that. We're all grieving, we're all remembering. And then when we do these acts together and we remember together, yes, we have feelings, but also it's that benefit of support that we were talking about. We want to remember. That's one of the painful pieces of grief is that people will say, I don't want to ever forget. But then I think it's our culture that's kind of held us back from having acts of memorialization.
Yes, I completely agree. And that's usually, I think, why people think that we need to limit this to the funeral or to the memorial service, because often in our society, that is the one place we have allowance for these sorts of acts, right? But how wonderful is it that we can sit here and we can talk about all of the different ways that maybe we haven't talked about before, maybe we didn't learn about when we were growing up or in our own grieving before we reached out for that good support that you were talking about, which we know is also a need. We have a need for support through our memorialization. We have a need to do so together and support one another. And even in our memorialization, it is so important in doing that more difficult work that you were talking about of getting closer to that pain and doing that mourning and acknowledging our feelings. So many needs are met through these different rituals and small acts of remembrance we can do.
That's a good point, too, because I think it's that, again, our culture, if you feel like you need permission, we're giving you permission today.
Yes.
You don't need permission to do an act of memorialization after the funeral. But gosh, it certainly feels like our culture says, you've already done that. You had the funeral. Everyone was there to support you. And I don't know about you, Maria, but I have had clients say, is it okay if I do this? Will people think that I'm trying to get attention or things like that? And it's like, no, this is a critical piece of your grief, and a critical piece of your mourning is this outward expression, and that comes through memorialization.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. And I think it's just so helpful just even to say it here, to say, hi, hello, we are grief counselors. It's okay for you to do these things. It doesn't make you selfish. It doesn't mean that you're behind or anything like that. It means that you are a normal, natural griever who loves their loved one.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And just to say that, because another way of memorialization is social media, right?
Yes.
So people will do posts. Maybe they'll share a photo or a memory or an inspirational quote. And I can remember, or I've had so many clients sit across from me, and they'll come in and they'll say, the anniversary is next week. This is what I want to post. Can I read it to you first and make sure it's okay? I don't want people to think I'm trying to get attention. And I just hate that we've done that to each other in our society. But again, we're sitting here saying, do it. Do the post. Share the picture. Share your feelings. Share your love.
Yes, definitely. And something you had said before that I feel like sometimes is something that people are concerned with when they're posting social media is where are my other loved ones? Where are the other people who are here at the table with me or on my timeline? Am I going to offend them? Am I going to make them uncomfortable? And I think that especially in social media, this is something I've talked about with my clients. If you have a certain loved one who just doesn't like seeing those sorts of posts, we live in a day and age where it can be like, okay, cousin so-and-so doesn't need to see this post.
That's right.
Everyone else can see this post and I can save them from that. We can go into the settings and say, okay, just this one person who I know is not ready to see this. But then everyone else can see this and I can do what I need to do to recognize and publicly share what I want to say about my loved one.
Yes. Because we often see that or hear from our clients that when they do share, how others will reach back out through that post and the support that comes and the memories that are shared and the love that is shared. And I think sometimes, too, those posts give, maybe more distant relatives or distant friends, the opportunity to really engage in that grief, too. And is grief shared? And we know grief shared is better.
Yes, exactly. Grief is not meant to be done all the time alone.
Right.
Yes.
So let's talk about some other things that people do as acts of memorialization. Again, there's small things that can be done, even daily in terms of dosing. If you listen to this podcast, we talk a lot about dosing your grief. And then there are the larger things. What are some that you see that have been really beneficial for families?
Something that I have seen that is beneficial for families, whether it's on special days or just on a day where we're feeling our grief a little more and we want to be connected and feel a little closer, is doing things that your loved one loved to do.
Oh, I love that.
Whether it's eating one of their favorite meals or going out to one of their favorite places in town, going to their favorite park, walking their favorite trail, enjoying the things that they enjoyed. Can be something that is just such a connecting point and can just feel so good and so natural as well. I've seen a lot of people find comfort in that because they're not here to enjoy these things, but I want to enjoy these things for them and with them as well.
And to a smaller scale with that, I've seen talked with folks about wearing their loved one's favorite color.
Yes.
And that's something that you can do. It's an act of memorialization that no one has to know you're doing it. No one has to know why you're wearing green today, or whatever it is, but or you can tell people, it's can be either or, but if you're feeling judged and those kind of things, there's ways of small acts of memorialization. And I know that people will do that maybe on their loved one's birthday, or even wears jewelry that was theirs, or their favorite sweatshirt, or their favorite baseball hat, something like that.
Yes, exactly. You completely read my mind, where it doesn't just have to be their favorite color. It can be something that belonged to them, and there's just something so special and irreplaceable about being able to wear the items that our loved one owned, right? To literally carry them with us throughout the day.
Yeah. And then there, like we said, things that can be bigger. Planting a tree. Some people will plant a memorial tree. I have very dear friends who planted a tree in memory of her husband and the father of the children. And now that is where the first day of school photos are taken. A dance picture, all the special things that are happening in that family now. When they take their picture, they do it in front of that tree. And it's a way to connect to Dad. If Dad were here, these just special times where we're thinking about him and remembering him. And I was talking to this family about this recently, and the wife was commenting that, yep, we took our picture in front of the tree, and I think she was maybe more afraid it was always going to be a sad thing, but it's very joyous. Like, they'll be in the house and the kids say, oh, okay, let's go out to the tree. They've named the tree, so they usually call the tree by its name, and let's go out there. And she said, it's just such a place of joy. Obviously, it's bittersweet, but it's such a connection for the family.
Yes, definitely. And I see something that we see a lot with our clients here at the center is that as we do these different things that we know are good and healthy for our grief, that there is a joy that is cultivated over time. At first, it is really difficult. It doesn't mean that it won't always be difficult on different days. But as we remember and as we recognize, we find that there is more and more joy.
So going into the holidays, if this is your first holiday season as you're approaching, Maria's talking about joy, you may not really feel joy right now. Joy may feel like such a teeny tiny little dot of light in the farthest distance. And that's okay. Sometimes with memorialization, it really is an act you're doing because you want to do it, you need to do it, but there's not a ton of joy. For example, at a funeral memorial service, like, obviously this is an act we're going to do, and you may feel moments of joy as remembrance, but the pain is just so big. And if this is your first holiday season, that pain may be so big. So I'd kind of try to encourage you to not set yourself up to do something that's just too big this holiday season.
Yes.
Some people go into that first holiday season and they may light a teeny tiniest, dinkiest little candle, and that's all you can do, and that's okay.
That's enough.
Right. That's an act of memorialization. And then sometimes people get into year 2 or 3 or 4, and then they start thinking, oh, I really want to, do something for a charity, or I want to go and volunteer, or this kind of thing. So there's always room to change your acts of memorialization. There's always time to add to them. But I would really encourage you, especially if this is your first holiday season, to really just be mindful of that and not try to feel like you have to do the biggest, grandest thing. Because remember, memorialization can be really small acts too.
Definitely. And just because they're small doesn't mean they're not meaningful. We know that we grieve because we love, right? And any of these actions are actions to show how much you love your loved one and want to remain connected to them.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes with memorialization, there's permanent memorials.
Yes.
So if your loved one is buried in a cemetery, that can be, kind of the headstone, the marker. If there's a plaque somewhere else in remembrance of your loved one. So sometimes an act of memorialization really is this permanent, physical memorial that you can go to and spend time with and see. And we see that as helpful as well for some people.
Yes, we definitely do. I had a client who, as a gift to her significant other for their child who had passed, had a bench that was made with her name on it and put it by the pond that they would all have their picnics by and hang out by. So it became this connecting point, not only for them as a family, but then also for them to connect to their little one as well.
Yeah, I love that. So some acts of memorialization, it is helpful when it is this permanent place that we can go and sit and visit or have a picnic as a family.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Other things are more like the physical reminders. We were talking about that, like wearing the loved one's sweatshirt. I know a lot of our teenagers in our teen group talk a lot about sweatshirts or jackets, things like that, that they feel connected and close to. They like to have on them. They like to be able to touch it. So sometimes there is that real physical aspect to that memorial.
Yes, definitely.
What other types of physical? I just think there's so many. Sometimes people will frame, maybe certain objects, make a shadow box. And so working through that, going through and actually touching their loved ones' things and collecting things to make a shadow box or to make a scrapbook can be a very helpful act as well.
Definitely. And I see a lot of grievers as well. I think it's something very natural we do as humans is to set up a little area in your home where maybe there's a photograph and some of your loved one's favorite belongings or things that remind you of them. That can also just be a way that you can physically show and memorialize your loved one within your home as well. Maybe with some of those items that you can't wear or that maybe you don't want to keep in a box that you want to show and display.
Absolutely. And sometimes families have T-shirts made.
Yes.
That's an act of memorialization. Another physical reminder. There's jewelry that people will make, whether it's with their loved one's jewelry or other types of memorial. I've seen, I had a client who took the keychain of her husband because it had been his keychain since he was in high school and learned to drive. And she made that into a piece of jewelry for her children, which I thought was really special.
Yes.
Memorial tattoos.
Yes.
We know that people will really think about that and have maybe a tattoo designed. I've even known a lot of people who probably would have never, ever, ever had a tattoo, but that's what spoke to them.
Yes.
And they created that. Several are coming to mind immediately who had tattoos created in memory of their children. And we're just so happy to be able to have that and to walk around in the world with it and have people ask them about it. And so when people asked about their tattoo, they were able to talk about their child.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah. So there's so many ways to memorialize your loved one. I mean, we've talked about a few here, but the list is just forever and ongoing. And we would love to hear more, from our listeners as well about what acts of memorialization have helped you and maybe your family. And again, we have to remember children need acts of memorialization, teenagers and adults as well. So all of us, it really is an important piece of our grief work. And that's because we know that it can help us, and it helps us through that idea of continued bonds.
Yes, and I have alluded to this a little bit as we've been talking about how it can feel good to remain connected, to not just remember for remembrance' sake, but to carry them with us and to walk along with them. And the reason why continued bonds are so important is because, Angela, we know that our relationship with our loved ones don't end when they die.
That's right.
Our love lives forever. So they live forever with us in our hearts. Yeah. So much of this process is how can we translate this relationship from one of presence into one of spirit and one of memory. So that is why this memory work, this memorialization work is so important to remain connected and to continue that bond because it's just so important. It is.
And it is, and I think we just need to state that one more time so that listeners hear this because, again, our culture and our world tells us that's enough, or why are you doing that so big, or you already had the funeral.
Yes.
Are you okay? Maybe you should talk to that grief counselor. So I think we have to say what you just said again, which is the work that we're doing in our grief is helping us convert this relationship from a physical presence. And that's the one we so badly want back, is that
Yes.
physical presence. But we know when somebody we love dies that we can't have them back in that physical form. And so all of this work, all of this grief, all this mourning is helping us move that into a relationship, a spiritual connection, a spiritual presence versus the physical presence. And that's where memorialization has a really big role, because it helps us with that expression and that connection.
Yes, definitely. And then also through that connection, it's not always even just connection to our loved ones, but it keeps us connected to those around us who also love them.
Yes.
Helps us to stay connected and find support as
Yes.
well, because when we grieve out loud, when we mourn, when we remember, others can see and they can gather around us and they can join us, because there is that elephant in the room that you mentioned earlier. Everyone's already thinking about it, right?
Yes.
So how important is it for everyone to have this open invitation to remember together and to support one another?
And especially at this time with the holidays, coming together as a family, if this is your first holiday, and knowing that we can do something to address all of our grief. And it doesn't have to be another funeral. It doesn't have to make the day a sad day, but it's a day about remembrance, and it is a day about expression. And sad is going to be in there. If this is your first holiday without your loved one, sadness is going to be in there. But through these acts of memorialization, joy also comes in a bit as well. And again, if this is your first year of grieving, joy might be really small, but it helps come in a little bit so that you know that others are in there holding this pain with you and that you're not alone.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
Thank you so much, Maria. I am just so honored to know you and so privileged to get to work with you too. Like we always say, grief is real, and so big. To our listeners, grief does heal. Let me say that again. Grief does heal. However, grief demands attention and care. It demands some memorialization. Grief needs support and patience. Remember that your grief is a reflection of your love. You are not alone. The world is full of grievers like you and me. If you want to learn more about us, you can visit our website at www.baptistgriefcenters.org. You can visit our YouTube channel, Baptist Centers for Good Grief. And remember, grief is real, big, better shared. We'll talk soon.